The Ashworth ballroom had been dressed within an inch of its dignity that evening. 300 candles burned in the chandeliers above, each one lit by a footman on a 12-foot ladder in the 3 hours before the guests arrived, and their collective light fell on silk and powder and the careful arrangement of faces performing their best versions of themselves. The Marchioness of Ashworth had ordered the floral arrangements from a hothouse in Kensington at considerable expense, and the roses stood in their silver urns without apology, red as ambition. Every woman in the room had dressed for the room, every man had arrived already calculating. And at the far end of all that candlelit deliberateness, seated at the writing table behind the second pillar, checking the evening's seating arrangements against the butler's original list with a pen she had borrowed and not yet returned, was Verity Ashworth, a cousin of the family by the thinnest thread of connection, a guest of the house by courtesy, and the person who had corrected 4 errors in the placement cards before supper could embarrass anyone. She wore the gray silk she had worn to the Pennington dinner 3 weeks prior. No one had noticed then, no one was noticing now, which suited her entirely. The Duke of Carwell arrived at 20 minutes past 9. She heard his name before she saw him, because in a room like this his name moved ahead of him like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward from the door before he had fully entered. Benedict Ashworth, 7th Duke of Carwell, whose estates ran from the Wiltshire border to the sea, whose name appeared on a dozen investment charters, and who had not been seen at a social gathering of this size in 14 months. The ripples reached the roses, they reached the Marchioness, who straightened her already straight spine and moved to receive him. Verity did not look up immediately. She finished her notation on the seating chart. The Earl of Coventry had been placed beside his estranged brother-in-law, which would have produced an incident before the fish course, and only then raised her eyes. He was exactly as she had expected from description. Tall, dark-coated, a cravat tied with military precision, the kind of man whose authority wore him rather than the other way around. He looked at the room with the expression of someone performing a duty he had agreed to in a more optimistic moment. He shook hands with his hosts. He accepted a glass and did not drink from it. Then, because he was the only person in 300 who seemed to be looking at something other than themselves or each other, his gaze moved along the far wall, past the second pillar, and found the writing table. Found her. It was not a look of recognition. He did not know her. But it was not indifference either. It was the measuring attention of a man who had just noticed something he did not have a category for, and who was, very quietly, filing the fact away. Verity returned her eyes to the seating chart. She had 4 more errors to locate, and she had not yet found all of them. She had not come to the evening to be noticed. She had come because the Marchioness's household ran, in 3 separate places, on Verity's attention, and attention was the one thing she had learned to bring consistently. Verity had arrived at Ashworth House 6 years ago, in the January of 1817, carrying a traveling trunk that held everything the death of her father had left her, which was the trunk itself, a box of account ledgers, and the knowledge that the Merton estate in Wiltshire had been mismanaged for the better part of a decade by the man now occupying it. Her father, Thomas Ashworth, had been the younger son of a younger son, which placed him at the outer ring of the family connection, where income was thin and expectation thinner. He had been a careful man. He had maintained a small property in Dorset, kept honest accounts, and raised Verity on the practical conviction that precision was a virtue available to anyone regardless of income, which was why she had learned to read a ledger before she learned to play the pianoforte, and why she could do both without error by the time she was 15. He died when she was 22. The property reverted on conditions she had no mechanism to challenge, and the solicitor who handled the estate had been more interested in the speed of settlement than its equity. She arrived at Ashworth House with £8, the ledger boxes, and a letter of introduction from the family solicitor that described her as a capable young woman of reduced circumstance who would be grateful for accommodation during a period of difficulty. She was not grateful. She was strategic. Within 3 months of her arrival, she had identified that the Ashworth household accounts contained a discrepancy in the quarterly wool trading figures that had been generating a silent loss of £60 annually for the past 4 years. The estate steward, a Mr. Holt, had not noticed, or had declined to notice, which was a different problem. Verity brought the ledger to the Marchioness's morning room on a Tuesday, set it on the desk, and opened it to the relevant column. You have been paying £70 per annum to a supplier in Bath, who delivered the equivalent of £10 in goods, she said. The invoices are here. The delivery receipts are here. The difference has been absorbed into the general household figure. Mr. Holt signed the quarterly review each time. The Marchioness had looked at the ledger for a long time. Then she had looked at Verity. What do you propose I do about it? Dismiss Mr. Holt, Verity said. Renegotiate with 3 alternative suppliers. Require itemized invoices against itemized delivery records. I can draft the new supplier contracts if you give me 2 days and access to the blank correspondence ledger. The Marchioness had given her 2 days, access to the blank ledger, and, without formally acknowledging that she had done so, the management of the household accounts from that point forward. This was how invisible labor operated. There was no title for it. There was no salary commensurate with it. Verity was listed in the household register as a companion and distant relation, which was what the Marchioness told callers, and what the footmen understood. What the footmen also understood, though none of them said it directly, was that when a decision needed to be made before the Marchioness had risen, Verity had likely already made it. She did not arrive at this position easily. There was a period of approximately 4 months in her first year when the senior housekeeper, Mrs. Greaves, regarded her with the specific wariness that one professional directs at another who has arrived in their territory without warning. Mrs. Greaves had managed Ashworth House for 11 years. She knew where the linen was kept, and she knew which suppliers could be trusted, and she knew that the second footman was not to be given responsibility for anything involving the good china. She did not need a 22-year-old cousin of the family telling her how to do any of it. Verity did not tell her. She watched. She learned what Mrs. Greaves already knew, and then, in the 4th month, when a supplier dispute over the candle order threatened to push the household over its quarterly budget on the same week the Marquis had announced a dinner for 16 with 4 days' notice, Verity sat down beside Mrs. Greaves at the kitchen table, put the figures on the table between them, and said, I think if we approach the mercer directly rather than through the trading house, we recover £11 on this order, which gives us enough margin for the dinner without touching the December reserve. The trading house takes 3% commission, we're not obliged to pay. Mrs. Greaves had looked at the figures. Then she had said, The mercer is a difficult man. I can write the letter, Verity said. After that they had an arrangement. Not a friendship, that word implied leisure neither of them had, but something more useful, which was a working partnership built on mutual recognition of competence. Mrs. Greaves knew the household, Verity knew the numbers. Together they managed both, without the Marchioness ever needing to notice the machinery. There had been a moment, in her 3rd year, when Verity could have left. A distant relation had offered a position as a governess in Yorkshire, a real salary, a formal title, a defined role. She had held the letter for 3 days and then written a polite refusal, which she did not explain to anyone. She knew what she was doing at Ashworth House. She was building evidence. She was learning what institutional management looked like from the inside, how money moved, how family interests were negotiated, how a household of 32 people was kept solvent and functional, while its visible operators took the credit. She was not resigned to invisibility. She was using it, deliberately, as the only laboratory available to her. She picked up her pen, returned to the seating chart, and found the 5th error. The Viscount Hargreaves had been placed at the table where his former fiancé was expected. She corrected it in a clean hand and returned the chart to the butler without commentary. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. It was the butler who told her, 3 days after the Ashworth ball, that the Duke of Carwell had called at the house to consult with the Marquis on a matter of estate business. She did not assign significance to this. The families had been connected for 2 generations, and the Marquis kept more than one iron in the fire when it came to investment partnerships. Benedict had arrived at 11 in the morning and was shown to the study. Verity was in the adjacent morning room, reviewing the quarterly household accounts against the supplier invoices that had arrived that week. With a cup of tea she had allowed to go cold. The morning room shared a wall with the study, and the wall, despite its impressiveness, was plaster and old timber, and sound moved through it without particular difficulty. She did not deliberately listen. She noted, as one notes information that arrives without request, that Benedict's voice was lower than the Marquis's, more controlled, and that he asked questions with the economy of a man who had prepared them in advance. She heard her own name once, or something close to it, and then realized it was the Marquis referring to Cousin Verity, in the context of the household arrangements. She returned to the invoice column. What she did not know, and would not know for some time, was that Benedict had arrived at Ashworth House that morning, with a specific piece of paper in his breast pocket. It was a report from a private inquiry agent named Corin, whom Benedict employed for commercial investigations, the kind of background work that preceded investment decisions or legal complications. He had not employed Corin to investigate Verity. He had employed him 3 months prior to investigate the management of the Ashworth household accounts, which had come up in a question regarding the partnership's financial health. Corin's report was thorough. It detailed, with some admiration for whoever had implemented it, a restructured supplier system, an itemized invoice requirement, a recovered margin of approximately £400 annually across 3 property accounts, and a set of annotated contract amendments that Corin described as unusually sophisticated for a household operation of this scale. When Benedict had asked who had drafted the amendments, Corin had required another fortnight to determine the answer, because the amendments were signed by the Marchioness, and everyone in the household attributed them to the Marchioness, and it was only when Corin pressed the question with the household solicitor that the solicitor said, with some reluctance, that the actual drafting had been done by a Miss Verity Ashworth, a companion relation of the family, who appeared to have no formal position, but was in practical terms managing the financial administration of the estate. Benedict had read that sentence twice. He had seen her at the ball, the woman at the writing table, behind the second pillar, cross-referencing something against a list, while the rest of the room revolved around its own reflection. He had noted the gray dress, and the borrowed pen, and the quality of attention she was paying to a document no one else had thought to look at. He had not known her name then, he knew it now. He finished his meeting with the Marquis. He thanked the butler. As he passed through the hall, he paused at the morning room door, which was slightly ajar, and looked in. Verity was at the table with her accounts, a pen in her hand, her head bent over a column of figures. Her tea had gone cold beside her. She did not look up. He did not announce himself. He continued through the hall and out to his waiting carriage. That evening, he sat at his own desk at Carwell House in Grosvenor Square and read Corin's report again from the beginning. Then he wrote a short note to his solicitor, a man named Geoffrey Price who had served the Carwell estate for 30 years, instructing him to prepare a proposal. He sat for a moment after writing it, his pen held still above the paper. Then he added a line at the bottom. Miss Ashworth is to understand that the role is substantive, the remuneration is real, and the invitation is not a courtesy. He folded the note and sealed it. He sat for another moment in the quiet of his study, the window dark above the street. The Carwell estate had been, for the past 3 years, a managed disaster. The steward he had inherited from his father was old and honest, and wrong about 11 different things, and the investment partnerships his father had assembled were generating 30% less return than their structures warranted, because no one had renegotiated a single contract in 9 years. Benedict had inherited the title at 31, following his father's death, and had spent the subsequent 2 years learning what he had inherited, which was a dukedom with excellent property and disastrous administration. He also had, in the east corridor of Carwell Park, a music room that had been locked since his mother's death, 14 years prior. He had unlocked it 3 months ago for the first time, for reasons he had not entirely examined. His mother had been a musician of real quality, self-taught in the main, who had composed a set of pieces she called her evening studies, 12 short works for pianoforte, none of them ever published or publicly performed, written in her own hand in a notebook he kept in the library desk. He had opened the music room, opened the notebook, and sat on the bench with the notebook in his hands for a long time. There was no one in his household who could play them. There was no one in his household who had been asked to. He sealed the note to Geoffrey Price and set it on the morning dispatch tray. He attended the Ashworth dinner the following Thursday. He was not in the habit of accepting dinner invitations, but he had accepted this one, and he arrived precisely on time and was seated 3 places from the Marchioness. Verity was not at the table. She was not expected at the table. She was managing the sequence of courses from the back of the room, where she stood near the sideboard and watched the footman, and corrected a timing error in the second remove without anyone noticing she had moved. Benedict noticed. He had positioned himself too. He watched her speak briefly to the senior footman and watched the footman adjust without visible disruption, and he returned to his soup with the particular expression of someone who has confirmed a hypothesis. She brought the household's evening together the way a well-built bridge held its road, the structure invisible, the surface smooth, the whole thing appearing to require no effort at all. It was Geoffrey Price who delivered the formal proposal to the Ashworth house on a Wednesday morning, sealed in the Carwell crest envelope with a letter of introduction that explained the Duke's requirements. A household manager for Carwell Park who would also serve in an administrative capacity for the estate accounts and the broader partnership investment portfolio. The role came with a salary of £240 per annum, private rooms in the East Wing, and a formal title of estate secretary. The first time, Price noted in his covering letter, that the Carwell estate had created such a role. Verity read the letter twice at the morning room table, the paper very still in her hands. She thought about it for 4 days. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, methodically, against the evidence. The salary was real, more than real, it was generous by any standard she could measure. The title was real. The Marchioness would release her without resentment, which was not the same as without regret, but Verity had learned to distinguish between the two. She thought about what she was leaving, which was certainty. She thought about what she was entering, which was a house she did not know, a duke she had met once at a distance, and a role that had never existed before, which meant there were no rules established for it. On the 4th day, she wrote a reply. She accepted. She added 3 conditions: itemized access to the existing estate accounts before her arrival date, a preliminary meeting with the current steward, and a clause that permitted renegotiation of her title and responsibilities after the first year contingent on demonstrated performance. She wrote the clause herself, in precise legal language, because she had been reading household and estate contract language for 6 years, and she knew how a binding clause was constructed. Price received the letter. He brought it to Benedict. Benedict read the 3 conditions and the contract clause. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Accept all 3, and note the clause." "Shall I note it in the ledger as exceptional?" Price asked. "Note it as the standard," Benedict said. Carwell Park was 40 miles from London, reached by a road that was good for the first 30, and then became a matter of faith. Verity arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late March 1820, in a hired carriage that managed the last 10 miles at reduced speed, with her trunk, her ledger boxes, and a new journal she had purchased before leaving, empty, leather-covered, intended for the accounts of a new situation. The house was larger than she had prepared herself for. This was not vanity on her part. She had imagined it carefully. But imagination and stone are different things, and Carwell Park was 3 centuries of stone, ivy-covered on the south face, with a front elevation that ran to 70 feet, and windows that caught the afternoon light and held it without giving anything back. It was a beautiful house. It was also, she saw in the first hour, a house that had been managed by habit rather than attention for some years. The butler, Mr. Aldous, received her at the door with the careful neutrality of a man who had been told to expect her, and had not been told what to make of the information. He was 60, precise, loyal to the household in the way that long service produces, not from warmth but from the investment of years. He showed her to the East Wing rooms, which were good rooms, south-facing, with a sitting area that had a proper desk. The desk had been polished recently, she noted, recently enough that the polish was still slightly tacky at the corner. Someone had prepared for her arrival. The maid assigned to her, a young woman named Polly, quick-eyed and unguarded in the way of people who have not yet learned to be cautious, appeared within 20 minutes of her arrival and offered tea with the specific efficiency of someone who had been waiting by the door. She had laid a fire already, and organized the warming pan, and set a small supper tray in case the journey had been tiring. Her welcome was not performed. It was the welcome of a practical person who had decided, in advance, and without much ceremony, to be glad that someone competent was arriving. "Is the kitchen all right for you to see this evening, or shall it wait for morning?" Polly asked, without preamble. This evening, if you please, Verity said. She toured the kitchen, the larder, the household linen stores, and the supply ledger room before supper. She did not make notes in front of the staff. She made them afterward, in her sitting room, by the fire, with the new journal open on the desk, and she wrote for an hour and a half until the candle burned down to the brass, and she trimmed it and lit the next. The kitchen ran on a purchasing system that was costing the household between 15 and 20% more per quarter than it needed to, through a combination of single supplier dependency and verbal ordering without written confirmation. The linen was in better order than she had expected. The supply ledger room contained 18 months of invoices that had been organized by date rather than by supplier or category, which meant that any analysis required resorting the entire corpus, which meant that no one had ever conducted an analysis, which meant that whatever inefficiencies existed had remained undisturbed. She closed the journal at midnight. She went to bed. She was not daunted. She was oriented. Benedict did not summon her to his study the following morning, which she noted as a form of deliberateness. Instead, he arrived at the estate office at 9:30, a ground-floor room near the library that had been designated for her use, knocked once, and came in. He was in a dark coat, without his hat, carrying two documents she recognized as the Carwell Investment Partnership Agreements. I thought you might want to see these directly, he said. I would, Verity said. He set them on the desk. He did not sit. He looked at the journal on the corner of the desk, closed, not visible in its content, and then at her. The steward's name is Mr. Frayne, he said. He is 63, has served the estate for 22 years, and is aware that his management of the accounts is no longer the primary function. He has accepted this without apparent resentment, which I believe is genuine. I would like to meet him this morning, if it is convenient. I will arrange it. He paused. Your rooms are satisfactory? They are. The desk has been recently polished. He did not respond to this directly. He said, I will be in London 2 days this week. You will have access to the full archive through Aldous. Price will call on Thursday if you have questions the archive doesn't answer. He turned to go. He reached the door and then turned back, not fully, just enough, and said, Your cravat, she said, which stopped him. He turned the rest of the way. She was looking at him with the particular stillness of someone who has been noting something for some time and has decided the moment to speak about it has arrived. It has been improperly knotted on the left side, for the better part of 40 minutes since you arrived, unless it was already so when you left the house. I did not mention it because it was not relevant to the account discussion. It is relevant now. Benedict looked at her for a moment. Then he reached up and rested one hand briefly against the knot, confirming it without correction, because he did not have a mirror and he was not going to ask her to fix it, which would have required her to step forward and reach up, and neither of them was prepared for that yet. Thank you, he said. He left. Verity returned to the partnership agreements. The partnership agreements were a problem, and the problem was not immediately visible, which was why it had persisted. The Carwell Investment Partnership, structured in 1813 under the late Duke, involved 4 other parties: Lord Severn, a wool merchant named Hartley, an investor named Charles Vane, and a property speculator from Bristol named Morrow. The partnership had been profitable until 1816. From 1816 to 1819, the returns had declined by 30%, and the last filed account showed a loss in the final quarter. Verity spent the better part of 4 days reading the agreements against the quarterly account filings. On the 5th day she found the clause. It was buried in the third rider to the 1815 amended agreement, written in the compound conditional syntax that legal language uses when it is trying not to be understood. The clause permitted any partner to renegotiate the commission structure unilaterally, in any quarter where the partnership's gross return fell below a specified threshold. The threshold had been set in 1815, at a number that seemed reasonable, given the returns of that year. By 1817, the general contraction of trade after the war had pushed returns below the threshold in 2 consecutive quarters, and Vane, who had apparently understood the clause, had renegotiated his commission upward without informing the other partners formally, which the clause technically permitted because the notification requirement was worded as reasonable notice, without defining reasonable. Vane had been extracting an additional £40 per quarter for 3 years. The loss in the final account was partly attributable to this. She set the relevant pages side by side on the desk. She drew a line in the journal, linking the 1815 clause to the 1817 quarter, and the adjusted commission figure. She added the 4 quarters to the present date. £480, taken slowly enough that no one quarter looked unusual. She went to find Price on Thursday when he called, and she put the journal and the relevant pages in front of him without preamble. She did not tell him what to think about it. She waited. Price read it. He read it again. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who has practiced not showing surprise, which meant she saw only the controlled version of what he was feeling. This would be actionable, he said. Yes, Verity said. Or it could be renegotiated. The clause is technically legal. The question is whether His Grace prefers to pursue recovery through legal action, which would be slow and public, or to remove the clause from the renewed agreement and require Vane to repay the excess as a condition of continued partnership. That requires Vane's agreement. Vane's agreement, Verity said, is more likely if he understands that the documented alternative is a formal legal action in which the clause and its deliberate use are entered into the court record. He benefits from the clean solution. It removes the liability. Price was quiet for a moment. You have drafted this? She opened to the next page of the journal. As she had drafted a renegotiated clause. She had also drafted a letter to Vane that did not threaten, did not accuse, and was worded with the precision of someone who understood that the most effective leverage is the one that appears to offer the other party something they want. Price picked up the journal and read both. Then he said, with the particular tone of a man who has been a solicitor for 30 years and has occasionally been surprised, "How long have you been reading contract law?" 6 years, Verity said, informally. He returned the journal. He took a copy of the clause and the letter draft, with her permission. He said he would present it to His Grace that afternoon. She had managed Ashworth's accounts for 6 years. She could manage this. Lady Constance Severn arrived at Carwell Park 11 days after Verity, announced through her father Lord Severn as a social call. A visit of 10 days that the previous social season had established as a reasonable expectation, and that no one, in Benedict's assessment, had given him adequate opportunity to decline. Lady Constance was 26, extraordinarily well-formed by every standard the season recognized, and had been considered by the Carwell extended family, in that confident way that extended families operate, doing their arithmetic before anyone has been asked, as the likely Duchess of Carwell for the better part of 18 months. She arrived with 3 trunks and a lady's maid, and the kind of self-possession that comes not from arrogance, but from never having had significant cause to doubt. She was not cruel. Verity assessed this within the first hour, and held to it throughout. Lady Constance was the system made into a person. She believed in the logic of her world, because that logic had always been correct in her experience. She registered Verity's presence at the Carwell dinner table on the first evening, with a single composed look that took in the grey dress. A different grey dress, a better one, but still grey, and the absence of jewelry, and the practical arrangement of Verity's hair, and then moved on with the specific generosity of someone who does not consider what they are looking at a competition. "You manage the accounts?" Lady Constance said, at the dinner table, with pleasant interest, the way one addresses a competent and curious member of the household staff who has been invited to dine. "Among other things," Verity said. "How useful," Lady Constance said, and then, to Benedict, "The South Gardens were lovely this afternoon. I had quite forgotten how well they arrange in spring." Verity returned to her soup. She did not answer Lady Constance with anger, then or after. Anger was information given freely to the wrong recipient. She answered her, instead, by continuing to be exactly what she was. She appeared at breakfast, and was already 2 hours into the estate correspondence. She managed the visiting schedule without being asked to. She found, in the 3rd day of Lady Constance's visit, that the Carwell Park kitchen had been ordered to prepare a dinner menu that exceeded the estate's weekly food budget by 30%. Ordered, apparently, by the butler in anticipation of the guests' preferences, and she quietly reconfigured the menu with the cook, in a conversation that took 4 minutes, recovered the margin, and the dinner proceeded without anyone knowing a decision had been made. Lord Severn himself arrived on the 4th day, accompanying his daughter, and the dynamic shifted in the way that a room shifts when the real question enters it. He was a large man in his late 60s, the kind of large that was once powerful and had simply settled, and he had the manner of someone who had operated at the center of his world long enough that the periphery was not entirely real to him. He registered Verity at the dinner table on the 4th evening, with a different quality of attention than his daughter had deployed. He looked at her in the way that an investor looks at something unfamiliar that has appeared in an account where it was not expected, with the specific assessment of a man, calculating whether it represents a liability. "You are the Ashworth connection," he said, not unfriendly, positioned. "Yes," Verity said. "And you manage His Grace's accounts?" "His Grace's estate accounts and the investment partnership administration," Verity said, without inflection. Lord Severn looked at Benedict. Benedict was looking at the far wall with the expression of a man allowing a conversation to proceed, because he is interested in its direction. "Partnership administration," Lord Severn said, after a pause. "That is an unusual arrangement." "It is an effective one," Benedict said, without looking away from the wall. Lord Severn said nothing further on the subject that evening, but Verity had noted the quality of his silence, and she added it to her private account of what the next weeks were likely to require. The music room was on the east corridor, past the library, behind a door that looked like the others but sat slightly differently in its frame. A door that had been kept shut for long enough that the wood had settled around its closure. Polly had mentioned it on Verity's 3rd day, not directly but by pointing out the east corridor's arrangement. "The library is here, and then the further rooms. The last one is kept private." Verity had not opened it. She had no reason to. It was not her domain. She was returning from the estate office at close to 10:30 on a Thursday evening, when she passed the library and saw light under the door. Not the library door, the one beyond it. She stopped. Then she continued, because passing a lit door in a house she did not yet fully know was not her business. She heard, as she passed, a chord, then a pause, then the opening phrase of something she did not know, a melody she had never heard, not a parlor song or a known composition, something slower and more irregular than sheet music typically produced. She stopped again. She stood in the corridor with her journal under her arm, and one hand pressed briefly against the wall, not leaning, just steadying herself against the unexpected fact of it. The playing was not polished. It was careful, the way someone plays who reads music correctly, but has not played for a long time, and is feeling their way back through a door they had not opened in years. She did not open the music room door. She stood in the corridor for perhaps 4 minutes, until the phrase completed itself and there was silence. Then she went to her rooms. She did not ask Polly about it, but she understood, in the way that someone understands a sum when the figures have accumulated past the tipping point, what the music room was, and she understood, with the same quiet arithmetic, what the Corin report might not have said about why Benedict had looked at her from across the Ashworth ballroom with the particular measuring attention he had deployed. She brought everything she had, and she put it to work. 2 days later she was in the library, at 11:30 in the morning, working through the investment archive, when the library door opened, and Benedict came in. He looked at the documents spread across the reading table, and then at her, and he seemed, briefly, in a way he did not extend, surprised to find her there, as though he had not entirely thought through the implications of assigning her to an estate office, directly adjacent to the library. He selected a book from the shelves and came to the table to read, which Verity had not expected but did not remark upon. They worked in the same room in silence for the better part of an hour. At some point he rose to replace the book and she said, without looking up, "Your solicitor's note from 1818 refers to a revised assessment of the Bristol property lease, but I cannot find the revised assessment in the archive. Either it was misfiled or it never reached the estate correspondence." He stood with the book in his hand, looking at her. "Price will know. I'll ask him. Thank you. You work late," he said. "The archive needed resorting," she said, "by supplier and category rather than date." He looked at the resorted archive on the side table, which she had been working through in the evenings for the past week, and which now occupied 7 organized stacks, rather than the previous unmarked pile. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Corin's report said you recovered £400 annually in the Ashworth household accounts. 415, she said. In the first year, the ongoing margin is higher because the supplier renegotiations compound. He sat down across the table from her. He did not open the book. He said, "What do you think is wrong with the partnership?" She looked up from the account filing for the first time. He was watching her with the same measuring quality she had first noted at the Ashworth ball, but closer now, and without the buffer of 300 other people. She told him about the vein clause. She told him about the £480. She showed him the journal entry with the linked figures. She watched him read it. The focused quality of his attention, the stillness of a man who is calculating while appearing to hold very still. "Price has a draft letter," she said, "and a draft renegotiated clause. They are ready to send when you direct it." Benedict looked at the figures for another moment. Then he said, "Vane will resist. Vane will calculate his exposure," Verity said. "The clause is legal. What he did with it is not illegal. But it is documented in a way that, made public, costs him more than repayment. You put this together in 2 weeks," he said. 11 days, she said. It was not a correction for its own sake. It was the precision she brought to everything, and he seemed to understand that, because he did not react to it as vanity. He looked at her across the table for a moment that was longer than the situation strictly required. It was not a romantic look, or not only that. It was the look of someone who has been doing difficult work in isolation for a long time, and has just understood that there is someone else in the room who speaks the same language. That look, Verity thought afterward, was more significant than most declarations. He was not going to tell her that. She was not going to say it. They went back to their respective reading. The partner meeting was called for the 15th of April. Benedict sent the notice. The partners assembled at Carwell Park in the estate's formal receiving room. Lord Severn, Vane, Hartley the wool merchant, and Morrow from Bristol. Morrow had sent a representative in his stead, a solicitor named Fielding. Price attended for Carwell. Lady Constance and her father were still in residence. Lord Severn sat among the partners with the comfortable confidence of a man who was attending a routine business discussion and had arranged the day to include a satisfying conclusion. Vane sat at the end of the table and was careful not to look at the documents Verity had placed at each seat, which were the resorted quarterly account summaries, with the relevant quarter's figures annotated in the margins. Verity was not invited to attend the meeting. She had not expected to be invited. She had prepared the materials, organized the presentation of the accounts, drafted the renegotiation proposal, and arranged the documents in the sequence that would make the situation clear without requiring argument. Price had her draft letter. Price had her annotated clause. She was in the estate office when Aldous came to the door at 11:15 and said, with the expressionless precision of a butler delivering unexpected news, "His Grace's compliments. And would you attend the partner meeting at your convenience, Miss Ashworth?" She set down her pen, she picked up her journal and the complete archive on the vein clause, and walked down the hall. The receiving room was quiet when she entered. 5 men at the table, Price standing near the window, Benedict at the head. She took the empty chair at the foot of the table, which had been placed there, she noted, deliberately. Aldous had known it would be needed before she had. Lord Severn looked at her with the specific expression of a man recalibrating what he thought this meeting was. Benedict said, "Gentlemen, Miss Ashworth has been administering the partnership accounts for the past 3 weeks. She has identified a question regarding the commission structure that I would like her to address directly." He did not explain who she was. He did not qualify the introduction. He simply stated the fact and gave her the floor. Verity opened the journal to the annotated entry. She did not look at Vane first. She looked at the table generally, with the composure of someone presenting a set of figures that speak for themselves. "In the third rider to the 1815 amended agreement," she said, "there is a renegotiation clause permitting unilateral commission adjustment in underperformance quarters. In the third quarter of 1817 and the first quarter of 1818, the partnership's gross return fell below the threshold. Mr. Vane exercised the clause in both quarters and in each subsequent quarter to the present, adjusting his commission by 20%. The adjustment was not formally notified to the other partners. The aggregate difference is £480 over 12 quarters. She set the annotated account pages on the table. She set the clause alongside them. She set her journal, open to the linked figures, in the center. The room did not react immediately. There was a long, suspended moment. The particular silence of people reading something that is not disputable, and understanding that they are reading something that is not disputable. Vane said, "The clause is legal." "It is," Verity said. "The renegotiation is legal. The absence of formal notification is ambiguous. The question is not legality." She set the draft renegotiated clause in front of Price. "The question is continuation. The proposed renegotiated clause removes the unilateral adjustment provision and replaces it with a unanimous partner notification requirement. Mr. Vane is invited to sign the new clause and to return the £480 to the partnership accounts as a condition of continued partnership, rather than having the existing documentation reviewed in a legal context." Hartley, who had been looking at the figures with increasing color in his face, said, "He took it from all of us." "From the partnership," Verity said. "Yes." Lord Severn was looking at her, not with the pleasant assessment he had deployed at the dinner table. He was looking at her the way he looked at a balance sheet that had surprised him, with the reluctant respect of a man who has been in business long enough to recognize when the numbers are correct. Vane said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "What guarantees that this doesn't go further if I sign?" Benedict spoke for the first time since handing her the floor. He said, "Miss Ashworth's proposal is the guarantee. She has structured it as a renegotiation, not a recovery. Sign the clause, return the sum, and the matter closes in the partnership record." He said it with the finality of a man who has already decided and is informing the room of what it has decided. This was his particular authority. Not performed, not raised in volume, simply absolute. Vane signed the clause. He signed it in the receiving room of Carwell Park in front of 4 witnesses, and his expression was that of a man who has made the correct calculation and does not enjoy the fact that someone made it necessary. When the partners had gone and Price had gathered the documents, and the receiving room had emptied to its ordinary afternoon quiet, Verity was returning down the corridor to the estate office when Benedict came level with her. He did not say anything about what had happened in the meeting room. He said, "The Bristol property assessment. Price found it misfiled in the 1817 correspondence. He'll send it this week." "Thank you," she said. He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before she stopped also, and turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the measuring attention of the ballroom, not the library quiet, but something more direct than either, and more deliberate. "The Severn match," he said, "will not proceed." She stood very still. "Lady Constance is a capable person," he said. "She would manage the role well by any reasonable standard." He paused. "You have managed it better, without being given the role, in 17 days, she said. "That is not a sufficient reason for what I think you are proposing." "No," he agreed. "The sufficient reason is that you are the only person who has been in this house in the past 3 years who speaks to me as if I am not performing a title." She thought about it completely before answering. The way she thought about everything, methodically, against the evidence. The salary was real. The title was real. The role had been created and she had already shaped it past its original boundaries. She thought about the music room, and the door that had sat shut for 14 years, and the corridor at 10:30 at night. "You will need to propose correctly," she said. "I will not accept a convenience arrangement." "I know," he said. "This is not that." He held her gaze steadily. "Not because it is convenient, or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you straightened the seating chart at the Ashworth ball before anyone knew it needed straightening, and you corrected my cravat because it had been wrong for 40 minutes and precision mattered more to you than appearance, and you walked past the music room twice and never asked me about it, and I have not met anyone in 20 years who understood the difference between what a room is and what it is performing." The afternoon light was moving in the corridor window behind him, Ordinary March light on plaster walls. Nothing extraordinary about the setting at all. Yes, Verity said. It was not immediate, not dramatic. It was considered, and quiet, and completely certain. She picked up her journal and went back to the estate office. He stood in the corridor for a moment, and then she heard him go to the music room. That evening, for the first time, she heard him play with something less than caution. The announcement was made at the Carwell Park dinner, 6 days later, before a company of 14, the Marquess and Marchioness of Ashworth among them, Lord Severn and Lady Constance not among them. Benedict rose at the dinner table and addressed the room in the precise way he addressed everything, with the economy of a man who has prepared what he intends to say and does not require decoration. He stated that he would be married in the spring to Miss Verity Ashworth, Estate Secretary of Carwell Park, formerly of the Ashworth household. He stated the date. He did not qualify the announcement or explain it. He sat down. There was the kind of pause that a room full of people produces when they are recalculating what they were expecting to think. Several people looked at Verity, who was seated 3 places from the head, and who returned their attention with the composure of someone who had sealed the relevant documents and was not reconsidering. The Marchioness, who had known for 4 days, because Verity had told her directly, and the Marchioness was the kind of woman who preferred information to surprises, raised her glass without visible surprise and said, "To Miss Ashworth," which settled the table. Lord Severn, who had been informed by letter, sent a reply that Price described to Verity as correct and brief. She did not expect warmth from him. Warmth was not the point. 2 weeks after the dinner, Lord Severn requested a private meeting with Benedict, and then, unexpectedly, a second meeting, alone, at the estate office. Verity received him at her desk. He sat across from her, with the discomfort of a man who has decided to do something he did not expect to do, and is doing it before he can reconsider. "The vain business," he said. "Yes," she said. I had seen the partnership accounts for 3 years. He was not looking at the desk. He was looking at the middle distance of a man conducting an honest inventory. "I did not see what you saw in 11 days. She did not fill the silence that followed. She let him hold it. "I did not consider," he said, after a moment, "that the function was being performed at Ashworth's house. I saw the household. I saw the result." He paused. "I did not look for the hand that produced it." "Most people don't," Verity said, without particular bitterness. "It is a consistent omission." He looked at her then, directly, in the way he had not quite managed at the dinner table. "My daughter would have managed the estate well," he said. "I believe she would," Verity said. "She is a capable person." He said nothing further. He stood, shook her hand, the first time he had offered it, and left. It was not a conversion. It was the partial, private, imperfect acknowledgement of a man who has conducted his own audit and found his previous assessment short of the mark. Verity held it in appropriate proportion and returned to her correspondence. Lady Constance departed Carwell Park that same week, with 3 trunks and her lady's maid, and an expression that was composed and self-possessed, and only very slightly more contained than usual. She had not spoken to Verity privately before leaving. There was nothing to say that would serve either of them. The season would continue. Lady Constance's credentials and beauty and certainty remained exactly what they had been. She would be received everywhere, by everyone, and she would be fine. She was not destroyed. She was simply not here, and the room had arranged itself without her. Verity and Benedict were married in the 2nd week of May, in the church adjacent to Carwell Park, in a ceremony attended by 50 people and managed, in the matter of its flowers, its order of service, and its small supper afterward, by Verity herself, who had written her own guest list and reviewed her own seating chart, and found no errors in it. He put the ring on her bare hand. She had removed her glove for the purpose, which was the entirety of the ceremony's departure from convention. When he kissed her hand before the congregation, he held it a moment longer than the form required, and she looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has made a considered decision and has no revision to make. The winter of that year, Verity produced what she called internally, and Price called formally, the Carwell Estate Reform Ledger, a comprehensive redocumentation of the estate's accounts, supplier relationships, and investment partnership terms. Rebuilt from the archive she had resorted, and the 6 months of direct management since her arrival. It ran to 4 annotated volumes. It included a new set of contract templates for supplier agreements, a restructured commission framework for the investment partnership, and a revised quarterly review protocol that required itemized verification against delivery records. Price sent copies, with her permission and Benedict's endorsement, to 3 neighboring estates who had inquired about the Carwell account's improved performance. 2 of them adopted the framework directly. The third adapted it and sent a letter of acknowledgement. It was not published. It had no single author's name on the cover page. It was titled, Carwell Estate Administration, compiled 1820. But Price knew, and Benedict knew, and the 3 solicitors from the neighboring estates who worked through its annotations knew, and Verity knew, which was sufficient. Their son, James Benedict Ashworth Carwell, was born in the following November, a child who arrived with the same economy of announcement that characterized his father, without excessive drama or inconvenience to the household schedule, which Verity acknowledged was probably wishful thinking on her part, but which was how she chose to describe it afterward. He had dark hair and her eyes, and, by the time he could reach the lower shelves of the library, a specific interest in the account ledgers, that Verity regarded as either hereditary or environmental, and could not determine which. A daughter, Eleanor, came 2 years later, named for the late Duchess, Benedict's mother, whose evening studies now stood on the music room's piano, in a proper leather binding, having been copied fair by Verity, over the course of 6 weeks, in the winter of James's first year, each piece transcribed from the original notebook with no errors she could find. James's succession secured the dukedom. Eleanor, as she grew, showed the particular quality of attention that notices what other people overlook, and says so at inconvenient moments, which Verity considered a reasonable inheritance. The music room was open now, permanently, its door repositioned in its frame by the carpenter, who had pointed out that the wood had settled around 20 years of closure and required resetting. Light came through its south window in the afternoons and fell on the piano that Benedict played, better now, with practice, and on the bench where Verity sometimes sat with the account correspondence while he worked through one of his mother's pieces at the other end of the room. They did not talk during these evenings. They did not need to. James eventually escaped his afternoon nap with the consistency of a child who has identified a structural weakness in the enforcement mechanism, and on one particular Tuesday, he arrived in the estate office at a velocity that suggested the mechanism had entirely failed. He made directly for the shelf where the copper inkwell lived, which had been his objective on 3 previous attempts, and was retrieved by Polly, who had been his primary containment authority since he could walk, 2 seconds before contact. Benedict, who was at the desk reviewing the season's wool accounts, looked up. He said, "He found the stairs again." "He finds the stairs reliably," Verity said, without looking up from the correspondence she was finishing. "It is the inkwell that concerns me." He rose from the desk and took James from Polly, and returned him to the corridor with the patient efficiency of a man who has accepted that certain problems require repeated application of the same solution. Verity finished the letter, folded it, and sealed it. When she looked up, Benedict was standing in the doorway again. He had come back, which he did not need to do. James was contained, Polly was present, the afternoon would proceed. He had come back because this was where she was, and that was reason enough. He was watching her with the expression she knew now, not measuring, not assessing, simply the steady attention of a man who has found the thing he wants to keep looking at. She knew he was watching. She had always known when he was watching. She reached for the next letter on the stack, and the afternoon continued, and the estate ran, and the accounts were correct, and the music room door stood open to the spring light coming through its south window, and the world that had failed to look at her for 25 years had not changed, but the life she was living within it had been built with her own hands and Benedict's deliberate choice, and it was solid, and it was warm, and it was entirely hers.